What's the darkest secret you found out about a family member? Story 1. My step-grandfather had a completely hidden life in Australia before he met my grandmother. He had a family and children in Australia and faked his death by driving his car off a cliff before moving to America. His children believed he was dead until my grandmother eventually found out about them and reached out years later. His son actually became a famous comedian over there, and from what I know, he has a joke in his routine about his father faking his death to disconnect from them. Story 2. My grandmother was assaulted by her stepbrother. She told her mother, and her mother literally responded, "Well, what am I supposed to do about that?" Fast forward to my mom as an adult. She was also abused by my grandmother's brother because he was allowed to live with them. He even once held her over a cliff at age 4 and threatened to drop her, only stopping when my grandmother saw what was happening. When my mother told her, my grandmother coldly repeated the same line her own mother had said. "Well, what am I supposed to do about it?" She then proceeded to guilt-trip my mother and even threatened not to visit on several holidays because my mom refused to allow that same uncle to attend Christmas parties or her wedding. The second part of the story isn't from my family, but from my ex's. My ex grew up being forced to visit his grandparents and stay with them because his mother insisted on maintaining a good, normal relationship with them throughout his life. Luckily, nothing ever happened to him. One day when he was around 22 or 23, his mom showed up at my house hysterical and crying. She then told him that her father had assaulted her regularly and had even held a gun to her head on multiple occasions. Naturally, my ex was furious and asked, "Why did you let me stay at a predator's house?" Her reasoning was that she just wanted a normal family. I was assaulted as a child, and I cannot understand the idea of having a child and willingly exposing them to someone dangerous just for the sake of appearances. I feel bad for victims, but when I see women like this, I can't help but feel they're enabling harm just like the abuser. Story 3. One of my aunts raised another aunt's baby as her own. My mom had 4 sisters and a brother, all of whom got married and had kids, so I have around 20 cousins. Unfortunately, 3 of my aunts developed breast cancer in their 30s. All 3 recovered, but years later, the youngest, Maria, was diagnosed again, and this time it was more aggressive. Maria needed a bone marrow transplant. All her sisters and children got tested, but no one was a match. That's when the family revealed that Maria had a teenage pregnancy. Her first child was actually my cousin John, who had been adopted and raised by my oldest aunt as her second child. None of the cousins knew this, not even John or the siblings he thought were biological. John was asked to get tested, and he turned out to be a match. He agreed to donate bone marrow to his birth mother, Maria. He was in his late 20s at the time, and had only had limited contact with Maria throughout his life, so the fact that he agreed was pretty amazing. The transplant worked initially, but unfortunately Maria passed away about a year later. Story 4. I found out 2 years ago that my mother had a baby she gave up for adoption 18 months before she had me, and then had another baby when I was 3, which she also gave up for adoption. All 3 of us have different fathers, and I think the only reason she kept me was because my father married her, though that marriage only lasted a year. My mother remarried when I was 5, and my half-brother was born when I was 7. As far as I knew, for 59 years, he and I were our mother's only children. I never saw her pregnant with the second baby because she sent me to live with my great-grandparents across the country during that pregnancy. My mother and grandmother were the only people who knew about this, and they both took the secret to their graves. The only reason any of this was discovered is because of all the DNA testing people do nowadays. This revelation deeply affected my sense of identity, my view of my mother, and our relationship. I've met my half-siblings, an older sister and a younger brother. I like them, and I'm glad I've been able to answer some of their questions, but the initial discovery really shook me for a while. Edit. This happened in the mid to late 1950s. Condoms weren't available to teenagers at the time. There was no education, no abortion access, and only unwed mother homes. She went to one when she got pregnant with my older sister because she was only 16. I don't know how my mother managed her pregnancy with my brother. She would have been around 21 and probably made up some story about a deceased husband or a divorce with her mother's help. I've never done DNA testing, but my half-siblings have, including the one I grew up with, whom I've always called my brother, not half-brother. I think they all used Ancestry. The siblings found other relatives first and eventually traced their way to me. I don't think I'll ever do DNA testing myself. I'm done with surprises. Other relatives were the ones who first told me about the siblings. The story is even more surprising because those relatives were my mother's half-sisters, from the father she never met and didn't know existed. They found me 8 years ago after doing extensive genealogy research. I also have a half-brother from my biological father, whom I met for the first time right before the pandemic started. I've known he existed since I was 19, but I wasn't able to find him. He found me. I'm 62 now. My adopted siblings were better off. Both my parents and my stepfather are deceased. I don't believe my stepfather ever knew about the adopted babies. I think the only other person who knew was my grandmother. I'm looking forward to reading all the comments and other people's stories. It helps me feel a little less strange about the whole situation. Story 5. My biological grandfather threatened to harm my grandmother while she was very young and pregnant with my uncle. Long story short, he was engaged to someone else. My grandmother became a nervous wreck during the pregnancy and wouldn't leave the house, and he used to throw bricks through the window. Eventually, she confided in some of her friends about what he had threatened to do. Not long after that, he went missing, never to be seen or heard from again. We always kind of laughed and joked that maybe one of her friends had scared him off or run him out of town. We even joked that someone might have done something more serious. It wasn't until we were going through her boxes of photos and love letters that we realized she had actually been friends with the Cray twins. Story 6. My uncle tells the story that when he was a kid, his older brother wanted him to go out hunting with him in the woods near their house. They woke up really early and started walking much deeper into the woods than they usually did, far off the normal trails they used. My uncle realized his brother was letting him get further and further ahead. He stopped and turned around to see his brother beginning to raise the shotgun in his direction. He asked him what the hell he was doing, and his brother said, "Oh, I thought I saw something." My uncle decided to head back at that point. Later that week, he returned and found a pit someone had dug a bit further off the trail. He never went anywhere with his brother alone again. Story 7. My parents had a nasty divorce, which was often accompanied by a lot of trash talking about each other. There was a lot of, well, your mother blah blah blah, and your dad is such and such, most of which I would just ignore because it was incredibly immature and embarrassing. Until one day my mom pulled out the big guns. My siblings and I were just watching TV in the living room when the conversation shifted to my dad coming to town to visit. My mom overheard. The mere mention of my dad prompted her to stop whatever she was doing, come into the living room and say something along the lines of, "Talking about your dad again, huh? Did you know that he was assaulted?" My dad had never mentioned anything about it in the 18 years that I lived with him, which is completely understandable. To this day, I have no idea why my mom felt the need to blurt that out to the three of us, or why she thought that being the victim of abuse was a stain on someone's character. But it was a really strange way to find out something so deeply personal about my dad. Story 8. My great-uncle is a predator who targeted underage family members. I don't know how many people actually know, but my grandparents certainly do, along with his victims, my mom, aunt, and at least a few of their cousins, though I'm not sure which ones. But then he found Jesus again, so we all have to forgive him and pretend nothing happened? It was before I was born, but that's the basic excuse I've always heard from my grandparents. They never actually acknowledge what happened, just that Tony did bad things, but he found God. I eventually pieced things together from my mom's history of abuse and how she always made sure my female cousins and I were never left alone with him. Now that I'm in my 20s, that duty has been passed down to me at every family gathering. It's like an unspoken rule. You can't say why, just the warning. Don't leave your daughters alone with him. I'm tired of it. Tired of shooing little girls away and having to pretend like it's normal. Scooping toddlers out of a predator's arms and acting like everything's fine, and I'm just overly concerned. When this is all over, I'm not staying quiet anymore. The next time I have to be around him, I'm taking children right back to their parents and telling them the full truth of why it's dangerous. I'm tired of protecting someone who should have never been allowed near a family again. Story 9. My cousin has been having an affair and physically abuses her husband because he won't believe the texts she claims aren't real, and she has even threatened to harm him and their children. Edit for more information. The man she had an affair with threatened her that he would leak all their private information if she didn't do what he wanted. He had taken screenshots and sent them to her husband. They can't go to the police because both she and her husband are mentally unstable, and their kids could be taken away. The husband is bipolar and works very late hours. There has been talk of divorce twice. The husband wanted to divorce her the first time it happened. After he found out she continued the affair, she said she wanted a divorce and claimed that he was violent toward her and the kids. The grandparents have offered to take the kids in. The grandfather has a well-paying job, and the grandmother is a stay-at-home caretaker who cooks, cleans, and manages household finances. The cousin's house, however, is filthy and unsafe. The kids often get rashes and sores from dirty diapers and insect bites. There's probably more to the story, but I haven't found out any additional information. Story 10. I'm the only child between my mom and dad, but they both had children from previous relationships. All of my siblings were 15 plus years older than me. When I was 7, my mom and dad split because my dad had feelings for my mom's oldest daughter, who already had 4 kids. Gross and awful, but they were both adults, so whatever. Cut to about 13 years later, and my dad was suddenly very involved in the life of one of that daughter's kids. 20-year-old me had no idea why. It took me another 7 years to put the pieces together and realize that my dad was actually the father of that child. I had grown up thinking she was just my niece, but in reality, she was my half-sister niece. I've never talked to anyone in the family about it. My mom passed away before I figured it all out. But wait, there's more. My family and I are all from Mississippi. Cue the banjo music. My dad was born in 1945, so unsurprisingly, he was extremely racist. And I mean extremely. That sister niece of mine, she ended up having 2 children with a black man who had 1 leg. The 1-leg part isn't really relevant except for the time he showed up at my house and started doing push-ups in the living room for no apparent reason. Anyway, karma has a way of catching up. Cheat on my mom with her daughter, father a child, then barely acknowledge her, only for that same child to grow up and, in his eyes, commit what he would probably consider the ultimate betrayal. I'd throw a chef's kiss here, except all I really think about is the pain it must have caused my mom. I was too young or too unaware to be there for her. Miss you, Cotty. Story 11. My parents told us they were married in secret until they found out my mom was expecting, and then they told their families. It later came to light that they actually got married on the day they found out she was pregnant and lied to both their parents and to us. But that wasn't the real surprise. My father was an only child, and his parents absolutely idolized him. They were very strict Catholics and extremely protective. They never allowed him to play sports because they were terrified something would happen to him. My paternal grandmother had experienced about 5 miscarriages. Anyway, after my dad's parents passed, he was going through their documents and discovered that they had to get married too. Their wedding license was dated 2 months after the date he had always been told. I know it's not the darkest secret, just a very Catholic secret in a very Catholic family. Story 12. My dad's friend died by suicide in front of him and a group of their friends when they were just 15 years old. They were all hanging out at the friend's house, having a good time, when he went upstairs, grabbed his father's pistol, and came back down calling everyone's attention. He then put the gun to his head, squeezed the trigger, and collapsed behind the couch. At first, they all thought it was some sort of sick joke, until they looked over the couch and saw his body in the blood. I first heard the story from my mom when I was 18, which explained some of my dad's behavior toward toy guns when I was a kid. I never brought it up to him. I just hoped he would open up to me about it someday, and eventually he did. But we haven't talked about it since. I'm amazed my dad turned out to be such a great man after going through something so traumatic at such a young age. According to him, it's something that has never left him. He still has nightmares about it and gets really uncomfortable in movies or TV shows where someone is shot in the head. Story 13. My grandpa, who died back in 2017, was a very quiet man and didn't talk much. A few years before he passed, my mom, his daughter, told me why. Apparently, when he was around 10 years old, back in the late 1930s or early 1940s, a girl around his age lived across the street. One time, they went out into the woods with his rifle to shoot at random things. On their way home, there was a fence they had to climb over. My grandfather leaned his rifle on the fence to help his friend over, since she was a girl. As she was climbing, the rifle fell and went off, killing the girl. After the police got involved, he was found not to be at fault, But the girl's family stood out in the street at various times over the next 2 weeks, yelling "murderer" at my grandpa's house. He eventually couldn't take it anymore and ran away from home. In his teens, he met a man named Rocky and befriended him. Rocky was supposedly in his early to mid-20s. Something happened where Rocky ended up passing away, and my grandfather took his name. I had always wondered why my grandfather had a different last name than his brothers. Here's where it gets even weirder. My dad was adopted, and until recently, we didn't know anything about his biological family. Thanks to DNA testing becoming common, we eventually connected with his biological family, including his biological dad, who was still alive and in his late 80s. After speaking with that side of the family, we learned that my dad's biological father had almost the exact same story as my mom's dad. He had also accidentally killed someone as a child, ran away from home, and changed his identity. Story 14. I found this out about 2 weeks ago. In my teenage years, my grandmother started dating a rough guy, and for about 4 years, we didn't see her unless we were picking her up from the hospital after he had assaulted her. I always thought we were just disappointed in her for staying with a violent man. But during a recent visit from my mom, I found out the truth. My grandmother's boyfriend was a large-scale drug dealer who routinely and publicly hurt people without consequence. The police wouldn't pursue him, and those who knew his identity wouldn't press charges. My mother and her sisters went to the county law enforcement office, and when they mentioned his name, the officers literally gasped upon realizing this man was in their county. They then said they could not discuss him any further without consequences. My dad worked for a major hotel and resort and had the head of security, a retired Secret Service agent, make a few calls. 2 days later, an FBI agent showed up at his office door, flashed his credentials, and asked why my dad was looking into this man. After hearing the explanation, the agent told my dad, "Let it go," and left. This man was in our family's life from 1993 to 1997 when he died of a heart attack. My grandmother passed away a few months later. We've speculated about everything from mob ties to him being a high-value witness in a protection program. I'm 40 years old now, and I still have no answers about this very dark chapter of my family's history. Story 15. I found out my birth father was still alive and living in California after being told for years that he had died in the Navy before I was born. Fast forward a couple of years, and a sister, whom I was told had died at birth, contacted me saying she had been adopted. I put the pieces together and discovered that my grandparents, my mother, then 16, and my uncle, then 14, were stealing cars in Southern California and running them down to Tijuana. When the feds started snooping, the whole family ran for the border and made it as far as Central America, where my mother found out she was pregnant with me. They then turned north and made it to Zapata, Texas, where I was born. She gave me the last name of her most recent boyfriend and told me he had died in the Navy. Less than a year after I was born, she gave birth to my half-sister and gave her up for adoption, telling the family she was stillborn. My mother was a pathological liar her entire life, and I didn't find out the truth until I joined the Navy at 17 and discovered that my birth father was still alive. I also later found out that my grandmother had been involved in S-work, had run a brothel, and had committed arson. But that's another story. Story 16. My dad was born in rural Texas in 1915. He was the youngest of 10 kids, all a year apart. So his oldest sibling, Henry, was about 11 years older than him. My dad's father died in an accident not long after he was born, so Henry became the man of the house at about age 11. When my dad was about 9 years old, 1924, a gang of men came through their small town, kidnapping children to work as laborers picking cotton about 400 miles away. Apparently, this wasn't an unusual occurrence at the time. My dad and 2 of his siblings were taken. Henry, now 18, came home from working on a cattle drive about a week later and found his mother hysterical over the kidnapping of 3 of her children. Being the man of the house, Henry strapped on his father's 6 guns, dual holsters, 1 on each hip, and set out to get his siblings back. He gathered clues about the gang from other townsfolk who also had children stolen. He headed east to where he believed the kids were taken, riding in empty train boxcars and even on the roofs of moving trains. It took him several weeks, but through speaking with locals along the way who had heard rumors of child abductions, he finally narrowed it down to a few cotton farms where he believed they were being held. My dad, who was 9 at the time, had tears in his eyes when he told me this part of the story. He and his two brothers, along with about a dozen other kidnapped kids, had been held captive on this cotton ranch for over 2 months and had given up hope of ever seeing home or their family again. They were locked in a barn, fed scraps, and forced to pick cotton in the hot Texas sun. They were beaten if they cried or refused to work. One day while working in the fields, they heard Henry's voice calling their names. They looked up and saw their brother walking toward them. They started running to him when one of the captors rode up on a horse and began yelling. Henry pulled one of his guns and shot the man. My dad wasn't even sure if the man had a weapon, and it didn't matter. The gunshot drew a couple more of the captors over, and Henry shot them too. My dad ran up and hugged him, and Henry said, "Let's go home." They rode on and in train boxcars all the way back west to their little Texas town, along with a couple of other kids who had been taken. When they got back to their farm, my dad said his mom fainted when she saw them. Henry put the guns away and never touched them again. There was no law enforcement, no investigation, no consequences for what had happened. Even though Henry had killed 3 men to save his siblings, it was still basically the Wild West in Texas in the 1920s. The boys all eventually joined the Army or Navy and served in World War II and survived. My dad didn't tell me this story until after Henry had passed. I had always known my Uncle Henry as a sweet, soft-spoken, diminutive man, maybe 5'4" and 100 pounds, who owned a printing shop. I would never have imagined him capable of the heroism he showed at 18 to bring his family back together. Story 17. I don't know if this would be considered a family secret since my mom grew up in a small town, so everyone probably already knew. I've mentioned before that my great-grandma died when my grandma was 4, and her father remarried a woman who had kids of her own. The step-great-grandma used to beat my grandma and her siblings terribly as soon as their father left the house, locking them in the basement all day, among other things. Obviously, this had a lasting negative impact. My grandma went on to treat her own kids the same way, unfortunately. One of my great-uncles became an alcoholic. He also robbed graves. Apparently, he had a fixation with gold teeth, but he also stole jewelry and other items he could sell for alcohol. My mom says she remembers him showing up at the back door when she was a kid, covered in dirt, and her mom would always take him in, feed him, give him clean clothes, and let him rest. Then he'd go right back out, drinking and robbing graves again. My mom always told me he died in an accident, but several years ago, one of my uncles informed me of the truth. He was found passed out on someone's front lawn. They called the police, and when officers arrived and tried to arrest him, he woke up and began resisting. During the struggle, the police killed him. Story 18. Well, this one may just take the cake. I come from a very violent family. It goes all the way back to our immigration from Ireland, where the family name was changed after they were disowned. Anyway, I have a cousin who is actually the child of my grandfather, because my aunt was assaulted by her father on her wedding night, with the involvement of her new husband. She is a very strange person and lived with her grandfather, Rash's father, for most of her life without knowing he was her biological father. I don't know for certain, but I think she eventually found out, because they had a major falling out and she beat him up. And that doesn't seem like something she would normally do. She has the mind of a child, really. There are many other disturbing stories of abuse and violence toward women and children in my family, including things involving my own father. I have nothing to do with either side of my family anymore, except for my 2 older sisters. My mother's side of the family are all Jehovah's Witnesses, and my father thought that becoming part of their community would be a way out of the cycle, but it wasn't. He presented himself as a saint in public and was a completely different person behind closed doors. Story 19. About 10 years ago, so before the Me Too movement, there was a time when many historical assault cases were in the news, and a lot of women were sharing their experiences publicly for the first time. That prompted my nan, whom I was very close to confess to me that her brother had tried to assault her when she was a teenager. I comforted her and didn't tell anyone. She passed away a few years later, and that's when I found out that my dad also knew, though he believed it had gone further than what she told me. He thought she had been assaulted, not that it had been an attempt. He also implied that one of the reasons his parents divorced was because of intimacy struggles that stemmed from her trauma. She always had trouble with men who were interested in her romantically. She would say she hated men, so it's really sad that she couldn't get any support at the time. Still, she was an amazing person and lived a full life with many friends. Literally a day after my nan's confession, I was with my other grandmother, and she said, "You know, all this stuff in the news is making me remember something that happened to me when I was a young girl." I was instantly worried there was another traumatic event in the family. Turns out she had been flashed on a bus. Still awful, of course, but after the previous day, it felt like a bit of a relief. Story 20. I found out that my great-grandfather killed my great-grandmother. I never actually met him. He died before I was born. But growing up, I always heard good things about him. My mom would talk about how he was very caring and calm. Then one day I found out that he sometimes hit my great-grandmother, and in one fight, when he was very drunk, he shot her. The worst part? No one in the family called the police. They sort of just hid the incident. He didn't go to jail or face any real consequences. I understand that this happened many decades ago, and society was different, unfortunately in ways that often failed to protect victims. It wasn't uncommon back then for people to look the other way when it came to violence in the home. Still, it was a huge shock to me, especially considering that everyone in my family always spoke about him so fondly. My mom told me he regretted it for the rest of his life and constantly talked about how much he missed his wife. But still. Story 21. Not exactly a secret, but definitely something strange. In the late 1960s, my maternal grandmother's husband divorced her and gave her partial custody of their two sons. During one of her scheduled visits, she took off with both kids and moved them from North Dakota to California. Her entire family was Seventh-day Adventist, a very close-knit community. So when she moved, she found an area with a large Adventist population, knowing the community would protect her from the authorities. Keep in mind, her ex-husband had never been accused of abuse. She was just angry that she didn't get full custody. This arrangement lasted from around 1968 to 1971. Eventually, she had a falling out with either her adoptive mother or a cousin, and they called her ex-husband, who came and took the boys back. My grandmother didn't face jail time for the kidnapping, but she was no longer allowed to see the children. As far as I know, she hasn't seen either one since 1971. The Seventh-day Adventist Church later paired her with another parishioner who became my grandfather. Neither my mom nor my aunts have ever met their half-brothers. Story 22. Okay, so maybe not as dramatic as some of the other stories, but my husband's legal name wasn't actually his name. To be fair, he didn't know either. It all came to light when we went to get his birth certificate for our marriage license. That's when things got messy. Let's say his name is John Schmidt. His birth certificate, however, said John Jones, but his license said John Schmidt. He swears that when he got his license 20 plus years ago, his birth certificate said Schmidt. The clerk's office told us that was impossible. The only record they have on file is for Jones. After lots of digging and making phone calls, I eventually figured out what likely happened. Back in the 1980s, he was adopted by his stepdad, Papa Schmidt. But since it was the 80s and no one really cared about legal formalities, instead of doing a proper name change, they just started using Schmidt as his last name. So my husband had to go through the process of doing an official name change, but it still doesn't explain how he ever had a birth certificate that said Schmidt. He swears he held it in his hands at one point, so maybe it's a false memory or we're in an alternate timeline. Either way, $300 later, his name is officially Schmidt, which makes me one too. Story 23. For context, my dad is the second youngest of 15 children. My oldest aunt had a son around the same age as my dad. We'll call him Vince. Vince and my dad grew up together, got along well, and Vince was even one of my dad's groomsmen. A few years later, Vince became very publicly religious and began trying to convince family members to go to church with him. People started to notice that he would change churches every month or so. Fast forward to when I was a baby. There was a family gathering and Vince showed up with his girlfriend. They made people uncomfortable, not just with typical religious talk, but by telling everyone they were going to hell for drinking alcohol, saying Vince was becoming a preacher and they needed to attend his services or be damned. According to my mom, I was sick that day, so she took me into a quiet room. She overheard Vince and his girlfriend in the next room talking about who in the family might be easy to recruit. She freaked out when she heard them mention my dad's name and his job, saying he might fund things. My mom rushed to get my dad, told him what she heard, and he confronted Vince. A big argument broke out, and Vince left, calling everyone evil and saying they were doomed. The rest of the family then shared what they knew. Vince had been kicked out of multiple homes for mooching, refusing to work, and stealing from relatives. It became clear he wasn't a sincere preacher, but a manipulator trying to live off others. By the late 1980s, most of the family had cut contact with him. At one family reunion, 2 aunts and some cousins refused to attend because Vince wasn't invited. They called him the Lion of God and said the family was wrong for rejecting him. Another fight broke out, and those relatives never showed up again. In the mid-90s, my grandmother passed away. One of those 2 aunts came to the funeral, bringing Vince. He was warned to behave, and he did, but my aunt was strangely timid around him and only opened up when he wasn't nearby. My parents didn't want to talk about it. Later that night, I did some online searching and found out Vince had become the leader of a religious cult. He had drawn in both of those aunts, about 7 cousins, and around 30 to 40 others over the years. He made them give up their possessions and work on farmland he had purchased. The produce and goods were sold for his profit. He especially targeted new immigrants and vulnerable people. He's still active today, and there are entire websites run by former members speaking out against him. Story 24. My wife is the result of a one-night encounter with several members of a soccer team. Growing up, her mom wouldn't or couldn't tell her anything concrete about her dad. She only showed her pictures of the team from that night and pointed to one of the players. She said his name was Martin and came up with a partially truthful story about him. Fast forward 30 years later, I used DNA tools to try and track them down. I say them because I narrowed it down to a few brothers who were on the team. A proper blood test would be needed to confirm. One of the brothers, Bobby, claimed she was his. He admitted that he used to use the name Martin when meeting women. Unknown to us at the time, he was the only single one and stepped up to claim her as his. All of the brothers had fathered children out of wedlock before, and one had almost lost his marriage over it. We met Bobby, visited, and got to know the rest of the family. Everything was going great. A couple of times I casually brought up that we still needed a blood test to be sure. Suddenly Bobby pulled me aside and said, "Hey, come help me with the grill." Okay. Once we were outside, he swore me to secrecy and told me the rest. Man, we were all messed up that night. I think around 8 of us were with her, and the others were involved in different ways. As far as I'm concerned, she's my daughter, and she believes I'm her father. The family loves her. Let's keep it that way. Story 25. My mom recently admitted that she might have a half-sister somewhere. She's been researching our family tree for a while now and mentioned she's hesitant to do a DNA ancestry test. When I asked why, she explained that her father, a known womanizer, had left a girlfriend shortly before meeting my grandmother. That ex-girlfriend later found out she was pregnant, but my grandfather denied being the father. Shortly after that, my grandmother became pregnant with my mom, and he stayed with them for a few good years. When my mom was around 5 or 6, the ex-girlfriend and her family came to the door, still believing my grandfather was the father. He wasn't home, and my grandmother, now with 2 young kids, sent them away. As far as we know, they were never heard from again. Now my mom is afraid that taking a DNA test will confirm a half-sibling just 6 months older than her. She may never be ready to know, but it's unfortunate because I might have an aunt out there that I'll never get the chance to meet. Story 26. A long time ago, I found out that my family has a history of mental illness, the kind that causes hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, and sometimes violent behavior. My aunt struggles with it severely. More recently, I learned that my grandmother used to keep her locked in her room every day, treating her terribly and making her, for lack of a better term, the house servant. Whenever she was allowed to leave the house, she would get involved in drugs, alcohol, and risky behavior, including getting pregnant between the ages of 14 to 17, before eventually being diagnosed and committed to an asylum. This was back in the 1960s through the mid-70s. After she was discharged, reasonably medicated, she was placed on disability and has been under supervised care ever since. But my mom later discovered that while she was institutionalized, she had been harmed multiple times by some of the staff. Since then, she's been under the legal guardianship of my mom and another aunt and has been living in a halfway house for people with mental illness. Story 27. My father was killed when I was young, and my mother struggled to care for me, so I went to live abroad with my father's sister, FS. Fast forward 11 years, my mom died from cancer. Over those years, we had stayed in contact, and I'd say we were even close at times. But during the final stages of her illness, when she was barely functional, talking about things like pine cones and Finland. My mom's sister, MS, started bringing up inheritance issues. I knew my mom wouldn't make it, but I didn't want to think about money before she had even passed. It just felt wrong. FS warned me to be careful around MS. Apparently, she had done something long ago that caused a major rift between my parents. FS didn't want to tell me what it was because she didn't want to change how I saw them. After my mom passed, MS told me she didn't want to talk about money or anything related to it and said I should wait to file anything regarding the estate. But it turns out she had already filed on behalf of my grandfather, my mom's next of kin, making him eligible for a portion of the inheritance. At the time, my grandfather was dying of dementia, and MS was his legal next of kin, which meant that once he passed, his share would go to her. He died just a few weeks after I found out about the filing. Every time MS has contacted me since, it's only been to ask for information that would help her gain more control over the estate. Since I'm in another country and can't be there in person, my lawyer is handling the situation. It's incredibly painful because I have warm childhood memories of MS, and this has made it clear just how far people will go for money. I finally asked FS to tell me the truth about the old secret because I needed to know who I was dealing with. That's when I found out MS and my father had gotten drunk one night and were together while my mom and I were home. They had an ongoing affair for a while. I don't put all the blame on MS, it takes two people, but I definitely see her in a different light now, especially given everything that's happened since. Story 28. My college professor uncle had always felt off to me, and I never liked being alone with him. He was well liked by both his students and his colleagues, and a lot of his reviews on Rate My Professors even called him attractive, despite him being a balding man in his 40s. I'll never forget the day he made his move. It was his birthday, and since I happened to be attending the same college he taught at, I was chosen to deliver his gift. I knocked on his office door, he said it was unlocked, and I went in. What struck me immediately was how freezing cold the room was. I couldn't stop shivering. My uncle was absorbed in something on his computer screen and didn't seem to notice. He waved me over to his desk enthusiastically, saying, "Come here and take a look at this." When I saw the list on his monitor, my jaw dropped. Titles like Dark Family Secrets, Worst Advice You've Been Given, Job Interview Questions. The list went on and on. He looked at me and smirked before saying quietly, "Nobody knows this, but I post the same questions on Ask Reddit every week and get away with it. There's barely any moderation for popular question threads, so it's easy karma farming. Then I sell the account to someone else and start over." I don't remember much after that, just the overwhelming sense that I had to leave. I sprinted out of the room and didn't look back. Thankfully, I had the courage to talk about what happened. Even though I couldn't prove what I saw, the story spread, and nobody trusted him after that. His colleagues lost respect for him, and his classes no longer had long wait lists. Hopefully one day, he'll be caught red-handed, and justice will finally be served. Story 29. My dad had a mistress and a daughter with her. She was born about 3 years after I was. That alone isn't so unusual, but how I found out and everything that followed is where it gets strange. As you might imagine, home life wasn't great, and I left the day after my 18th birthday. I never really looked back, especially when it came to my dad. I joined the military and got my life together. My dad passed away while I was still serving, and I didn't attend the funeral. After I got out, I went to college in my home state. That's where I met a girl, Mary, in my physics study group. We hit it off. We had a lot in common, including being estranged from our families. We dated, moved in together, had a great relationship, and even talked about marriage. But after almost 2 years, we broke up and eventually lost touch. Later on, I tried reconnecting with my mom a few times, but she was still bitter and toxic. I eventually gave up. She's had a stroke since then, and now she thinks I'm her boyfriend and that she's in high school. You can probably guess where this is going. Years later, I took a 23andMe DNA test. When the results came in, I saw that I had a half-sister. We shared a father. I looked into it, and after seeing the profile picture, I realized it was Mary. She must have gotten the same notification because she reached out to me through the site. We eventually talked on the phone. She told me she never knew who her dad was, just that he occasionally sent her mom money. I told her she hadn't missed much. We agreed not to tell our families, or anyone else, about our past relationship. If anyone ever asked, we just say we were friends in college. I'm not on social media, so that helps. We haven't reconnected beyond a few phone calls. I'm not sure if I should do anything more or just let it be. Story 30. My uncle was in and out of South African prison gangs for over a decade. Drugs, armed robberies, and all that. These are some of the most dangerous prisons and gangs in the world, easily comparable to what you'd see in places like Mexico. He's clean now and works in a program that helps rehabilitate people like himself. He's reunited with his kids and doing well. I don't know why, but my parents raised me, the middle child and only son, to be as naive as possible. We never talked about taboos like drugs or S. I never understood why my uncle would show up at our gate asking for food and money. My gran would tell me to lie and say he hadn't been there that day. They'd lock all the bedroom doors and keep the keys if he came over. Only when I started going down the wrong path did he open up to me, hoping to scare me straight. I started spending time with him without my parents knowing, and he was always good to me. He never used around me, and I never used around him. He always spoke negatively about his old lifestyle. He really did try to steer me away from it, but I was stubborn and had to learn the hard way. I'm clean now too, and I didn't go nearly as far down that path as he did. Story 31. My brother and I, 7 and 3 years old at the time, were getting a bath from our mother when we heard a massive bang in the living room where my dad was watching TV. We both started crying instantly, and our mom ran off to check what had happened. She came back crying but told us, "Don't worry, everything's fine. Your dad shot his gun by mistake because he thought there was a burglar." And of course, we believed her. We were young and naive. After the bath, we went to see our dad, still alive, and he gave us a big hug, completely unexpected. He reassured us, saying he thought there was a burglar, and showed us the bullet hole through the sofa, the chip in the floor tile where the bullet hit, and the actual bullet flattened like a pancake. It wasn't until recently that I remembered this moment and realized what had actually happened. My dad had been planning to harm himself on that sofa, and at the last second, he pulled the gun away, firing into the sofa instead. That explains why my mother came back crying, because she knew exactly what almost happened and had to come up with a story to keep us calm. It also explains the big hug my dad gave us, because he had come so close to not being there. He hasn't tried anything since and is still alive and well at 65 years old. Story 32. My mother was assaulted by her grandfather when she was young. Later, when she got pregnant with my older sister, her father accused her of trying to steal her older sister's thunder because she had just gotten pregnant too. Because of this treatment and the way she was raised in general, my mom left Germany and moved to Missouri with my dad. Unfortunately, my dad cheated on her multiple times, likely had children with other women, and eventually gave my mom herpes. She hid most of this from us kids until we were old enough to understand. When we finally went back to Germany to visit 16 years later, the first thing her sister said was, "Wow, you've gotten fat." My aunt wasn't skinny, just a cruel person. And yet, through all the awful things thrown her way, my mom is a total badass. She pretty much single-handedly raised 3 kids who all earned college degrees, the first out of all the cousins on both sides of the family. She always stood up for us, even when teachers treated us unfairly because we were poor. And she even respected me when I came out as an atheist. Story 33. My dad tried to kill me. My little brother has always been sickly. He had trouble breathing and would sometimes need to be rushed to the hospital. Please don't ask what the condition was. I don't know. Anyway, one day my mom told my dad that my brother was sick and needed medicine. My dad didn't want to give her money. He said he'd go buy it himself. My mom started getting the kids ready to go to the pharmacy anyway. My dad said no, he didn't want us to go. He insisted we stay home and let my 4-year-old sister watch us. My mom refused. He was furious, but she got us all in the car anyway. While we were driving, my dad started ramming his vehicle into ours. Eventually, he tried to knock us into a ditch, one that likely would have flipped the car and killed us all. My older sister screamed out the window, and some random guy leaned out of his car and shouted that he was going to call the police. He told my dad that he better hope they did something, because if they didn't, he would handle it himself. My dad drove away. My mom called my grandmother crying. My grandmother then called my dad and said that if he ever tried anything like that again, she'd kill him and feed him to her hogs. This lovely story was told to me on my 23rd birthday by my gran, after I said I was upset because my boyfriend had just broken up with me. Story 34. There was a family member back in the 1950s or 60s. He was in his 20s, I think. I believe he was my grandmother's cousin. One day he took his dad's car out for a ride and crashed it. He died instantly on impact. What he didn't know was that his father had been working on the car and the brakes had been disconnected. When I was about 5, my mother kidnapped me from my father. She and her friends abused and neglected me pretty severely. When I was 7, my dad won full custody. He was a good father at first, but as I got older, he became increasingly verbally abusive. It wasn't until I was a teenager that I found out my mother had a child with another man before she met my dad. She abused that child too. He was eventually taken away from her after she made him eat dog food out of bowls on the floor. I also learned that my dad hadn't wanted to be a parent in the first place. My mom had stopped her birth control without telling him. She wanted a reason to stop working. My dad would come home from a full day's work and find that she hadn't fed me, changed me, or cleaned anything, despite being a stay-at-home mother. That's when I began to understand why my dad blamed every inconvenience on me. Why he called me names. Why he told me he wished I'd never been born. He resented me. The abuse I went through became a big family secret. Anytime I tried to talk about it, I was silenced. They didn't want that kind of burden on the family name. I'm no longer in contact with any of them. Story 35. That my father had more children than just my siblings. My parents got divorced around the time I was 9. We didn't think much of it because they never really liked each other, but my dad was always sneaky, late nights out, random numbers in his phone. After the divorce, he kept me and my siblings' birth certificates because he had better security at his place than my mom did. For my 14th birthday, I got my nose pierced, so we needed a copy of my birth certificate. We went to my dad's place to get it, and while he was looking through the files, I saw multiple other names listed under his name. He noticed me looking, started shuffling through the papers faster, and eventually found mine. I never asked him about it, but I plan to get a DNA test to find out if I actually have more siblings. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I remember seeing children's names, specifically Marissa and John, I believe. Story 36. I won't go too deep, but I'll share something more innocent. Both of my great-grandfathers lived to be quite old, and I didn't speak Finnish very well. As a kid, I'd occasionally spend Sundays with my grandfather and great-grandfathers. We'd talk, and sometimes they'd give me a little brandy and let me smoke. They told stories, usually with my grandfather translating for me. During the war, they would trade stories, some of which my grandfather would hold back on. They talked about brutal acts, cutting off hands, removing tongues, and for the worst enemies, they would cut off heads and place them on fence posts. The only people they hated more than the Nazis were the Russians. There was a kind of intense, unsettling energy in my great-grandfather's eyes as he described one particular moment, when he had disfigured a man's face but deliberately let him live, so he'd carry the shame forever. He believed that was justice. To them, it was a matter of pride. When they talked about Helsinki, they said if the odds had been 1 to 10, they would have fought to the death. According to them, a Finnish man was worth 15 Russian soldiers, and they weren't close to being outnumbered at that ratio. Story 37. I was always bullied for having a big family. People at school constantly called me a traveler, and I never really understood why. I just assumed it was a normal Irish thing. All of that changed in 2019 when I discovered the real reason behind my large family. Most of my relatives are children born as a result of abuse, and my granddad was a serial abuser. I had always felt that something was off. My grandparents are very wealthy, millionaires, and they were always handing out money to their children for various things. Many of my relatives have serious mental health issues or struggle with addiction. My grandfather paid for their therapy, rehab, and more. It always seemed strange to me, especially since the kids could afford those things themselves. But it turned out it was hush money. I'm the first grandchild out of 30 who wasn't harmed by him. I didn't know this at the time, of course. All I knew was that every Christmas, the oldest grandchild was given my grandfather's debit card, and we were told we could buy whatever we wanted. I thought it was just a generous holiday gift. But again, it was hush money. Everything came to light in 2019. After years without any new reports, the family assumed it was finally over. But then, it started happening again. The younger kids were being targeted, and the family had had enough. They couldn't take it anymore, especially not when it came to the children. It's been 2 years since then. More victims have come forward, including people we never knew had been affected. It's overwhelming, but at the same time, it's a relief to finally know the truth. Story 38. I come from a fairly large family on my dad's side. I have 17 first cousins, but I've always been especially close to one cousin. We've been tight since second grade. Her dad and my dad were brothers and best friends, so we practically grew up together. My parents divorced when I was 3, so my mom wasn't around my dad's side of the family much. One summer when I was visiting my mom as a young adult, we started talking about family. I mentioned my cousin and some of the crazy adventures we had, and my mom said something that completely threw me. She casually said she was glad my uncle treated my cousin like his own. I was confused. I asked what she meant, and she looked at me seriously and said, "You know she's adopted, right?" No, I had no idea. She immediately looked guilty and said she didn't realize it was such a big family secret. It turned out that my aunt's niece from her side of the family had become pregnant at a young age, and my aunt took in the baby, my cousin. That knowledge weighed heavily on me for years. Eventually, I told my cousin. There was a small falling out between me and my aunt because of it, but my cousin said the only thing she regretted was not getting the chance to tell her dad how much she appreciated his love and devotion, even though she wasn't biologically his. Story 39. My mom was almost incarcerated for murdering her mother. My grandmother had become very sick. None of my mom's siblings or other relatives wanted to take care of her, so my mom stepped up. Now the details are a little hazy because this is something I discovered accidentally while snooping in her journals as a nosy teenager, and I've never had the courage to bring it up. From what I gathered, my mom cared for my grandmother for about a year or two before she passed, but according to her doctor's records, my grandmother died too soon. My mom didn't know what to do when she passed and ended up sitting next to her body for 3 days. The police got involved because my mom hadn't returned to work, and my godmother became worried and called for a wellness check. My mom ended up in custody. My aunt and uncle believed she had caused their mother's death and wanted her to go to jail. The only one who really stood by her side and tried to help was my godmother. In the end, my mom wasn't charged with anything, but the experience haunts her to this day. It also inspired her to become a hospice nurse, dedicating her life to caring for people during their final days at home. Story 40. My great-grandfather liberated my great-grandmother from Birkenau concentration camp in 1945 and brought her back to Edinburgh, where he married her. Together, they had my grandfather. My grandfather spent his youth and young adulthood idolizing his father, believing he was a hard-working man, providing for the family by working on the docks in Leith. Then on his deathbed, my great-grandfather confessed something that shattered everything. He told my grandfather that he had actually been a gangster, had robbed and killed people, and had led a prominent gang in Leith for years. He used his final moments to unburden himself, and it completely destroyed my grandfather's view of the man he had worshipped his whole life. Apparently, many people already knew. Just not him. Worse still, my great-grandfather confessed to having been brutally abusive to my great-grandmother throughout their marriage. I wasn't alive at the time, but I've been told it shook the entire family. No one ever talked about it again. I only found out myself a few years ago. Story 41. Growing up, I always knew I had an older sister. My mom talked about her fondly and even got a tattoo with all her children's first initials. I was originally told that my mom was very young and couldn't provide for her, so adoption was the best option. Turns out the story was much darker. My mom was 13 at the time and in a relationship with a 25-year-old man. She kept the pregnancy hidden until her 3rd trimester. When my grandmother found out, she demanded my mom get an abortion, but it was too late. So instead, she told my mom that if she didn't give up the baby, she'd be out on the streets with a newborn and nowhere to go. Then she threatened my sister's father, telling him to sign away his parental rights or face legal consequences. But wait, there's more. My grandmother then offered my sister for adoption to a coworker who had been trying to conceive. She convinced my mom that the baby would have a better life and that it was in everyone's best interest. My mom reluctantly agreed, with 2 stipulations, that her daughter be named Elle and that she would receive regular updates and possibly visits. But again, there's more. A year after the adoption, my grandmother told her coworker that my mother never wanted to hear from them again and cut off all contact. We later found out that she never even passed along the name request, though oddly enough, my sister was still named Elle. My grandmother continued working with that woman for 10 more years. I found my sister on my 21st birthday. We had lived in the same town for years, had mutual friends, and even ran into each other once. Sadly, she had a very rough life. My mom now refuses to spend time with her or her kids. She says she can't stand the person my sister has become. Before my grandmother passed during a drive to one of her chemo treatments, she told me that her biggest regret was not realizing what was happening sooner and not forcing my mom to go through with the abortion. Story 42. On my father's 18th birthday, he was sat down by his parents for a serious conversation. Without even trying to cushion the blow, they told him point blank that he was adopted. He didn't believe them at first, so his mother showed him his birth certificate for the first time in his life. Listed as the birth mother was a woman he'd never heard of. And under father, it said one word: rape. His parents didn't know much about his biological mother, only that she had been a very young girl who became pregnant after being assaulted and gave him up at birth. Then came another shock. They told him that the woman who had raised him as his mom was actually his third mother. His much older sister had been the first to adopt him. She had thought having a baby would be fun, but after a few months the novelty wore off and she decided parenting wasn't for her. When her parents found out she was planning to return him to the orphanage, they were furious because, according to them, it would have embarrassed the family. So instead of returning the baby to the state, she handed him over to her parents. From that point on, the woman he had always called his sister became his mother, and he was raised as their son. After hearing all this, my father was understandably in shock. He remembers sitting across from them, frozen, unable to speak. And then he remembers very clearly, they told him that now that he was 18, he should probably move out. Story 43. My story might pale in comparison to some of the others shared here, but I'll share it briefly. As it turns out, my entire immediate family was involved in a plan, led by my mother, to have me institutionalized. Essentially, they wanted me permanently placed in a mental health facility. Their mistake? They documented the entire thing. I eventually became aware of it when one of them accidentally copied me on an email thread that included their detailed, sinister plan to have me institutionalized. The level of detail they went into was disturbing. For context, I have epilepsy, though it is controlled. Even in cases where epilepsy isn't controlled, there is absolutely no justification for infringing on someone's basic rights or institutionalizing them. I also have a son, and this was clearly my mother's way of trying to remove him from my care. Thankfully, it didn't work. I thought about filing temporary restraining orders against them. But how do you do that against your entire family? In the end, I decided to have a very stern, direct conversation with them. A few months later, a police officer knocked on my door. He said there had been a report about improper care of my son. I invited him in, and it was immediately clear that everything was fine. He couldn't tell me who had made the report at first, but I suggested it may have been my own mother, who lives more than 6 hours away. She has a history of memory lapses and extreme attempts to control others, often in strange and harmful ways. Eventually, the officer confirmed that she was indeed the one who filed the report. I never had any more problems after that. This all happened several years ago, and thankfully, things have been peaceful since. I don't think their plan would have gotten very far, but honestly, who knows? People have been institutionalized for far less. Story 44. My grandfather had a whole other woman he was living with for over 30 years. He would leave to stay with her for 3 days a week and told everyone he was going on a business trip. When my mom found out, she was only 15 at the time, she tried to tell my grandmother and aunts, but no one believed her. Or maybe they didn't want to believe her, because they were scared of being left without a dad or a husband. So she stayed quiet for years, and it ate her up inside. When I found out, after everyone else already knew, I was furious. People just let it go and forgave him because of his reputation. I was disgusted. I wish he had been held accountable for what he did, but instead, he got away with it and lived a happy life, full of money and comfort. He's gone now, but the final blow came after he passed. His other woman, yes, the one he was with for decades, was at his deathbed the morning he died, before any of us got there. And after he passed, we discovered he had changed his will. He gave all his money to her and left the rest of us with nothing.